Hey everyone, it's Jaeyoung here, and welcome to the Overwatch patch 1.34 overview. As usual, the link to the rundown video is down in the description below. This is a really long patch, so let's not waste time with an intro and let's get to it.
Oh, this is my jam!
Surprisingly, DOOMFIST has received a buff this patch. His Seismic Slam and Rising Uppercut both have had their cooldowns reduced from 7 to 6 seconds. Additionally, a bug has been fixed where Seismic Slam didn't pull enemies in as actually intended. So ever since his last nerf punched him into the ground, he's been a pretty lackluster hero. The distance nerf on his slam was pretty jarring in that it cut down both his mobility as well as offensive potential. For a hero that relies on getting in and out of fights as quickly as possible, it was a pretty big nerf to him. This buff tries to circumvent that weakness by giving him more combo uptime. The changes are pretty decent, but I'm not sure it's the kind of change that he needs, so we'll have to see if they actually help that much. SOMBRA has also received a buff in that hacking a health pack would cut your hack cooldown in half. So instead of it going on an 8-second cooldown, it instead goes on a 4-second one. This is a really interesting change in that in a SOMBRA MOIRA matchup, it will heavily favor the defensive SOMBRA. Usually the round would start and you would hack a health pack the moment you could, and the cooldown would end just in time to hack an enemy coming in. But this time you could possibly hack 2 health packs instead and still have your hack available off cooldown when the enemy comes in. So not having to second guess whether hacking a health pack is worth it will make playing SOMBRA a lot more fluid. Additionally, the hack status effect visuals are now more noticeable than before to make it easier for your team as a whole to possibly prioritize a target. Okay, so the buff GENJI has received isn't really a flat out buff. What used to happen is that if you used your Deflect at the end of your Dragonblade, the sheathing animation could cancel your Deflect early. But now, your Deflect is given time to keep its whole duration, and only once it ends does GENJI sheath his blade. So it's a really nice quality of life buff because in my opinion, more control over your hero is always good. SYMMETRA's Photon Projector has been buffed to have a faster damage ramp speed for her laser by 20%. Obviously, this is a flat-out buff that allows players to achieve and retain max damage output more easily. I feel like SYMMETRA is in a pretty good spot at the moment on ladder. She has her nice niches where she can be used, particularly on assault maps while playing defense. Having said that, I'm not sure this 20% buff is particularly useful. I would be more of a fan if her beam length was buffed slightly, but that can get out of hand pretty fast. Either way, it's a nice little nudge up to her offensive power. Okay, I didn't expect MOIRA to receive a buff, but I honestly can't say that I'm surprised. So her Biotic Grasp healing has been increased from 50 to 65 total healing over a period of 4 seconds, up from 3 seconds. This makes the raw healing per second just ever so slightly lower, but obviously the total healing is greater. So in this sense, you'll get more miles out of your mileage that is your healing bar. The reason I say I'm not surprised MOIRA received the buff is that she's quite an underwhelming support hero at the moment. Sure, in terms of short range raw healing, she's pretty damn good. But the utility she brings is pretty bad when compared to the rest of the supports. But with Lucio and Zenyatta taking a hit to their utility this patch, which I'll cover later on, perhaps this is an effort to bump up her usefulness. Ho ho! At long last, we see Soldier 76 damage buffed to be reverted to 20 damage a bullet, up from 19. You might be thinking, a single damage point increase might not seem like much, but believe me when I say it's very significant due to the change in breakpoints and number of bullets needed to kill an enemy. Now this is like super exciting me because the last time Soldier had a strong presence in the meta, it was when he had 20 damage bullets. So now that we're back to that, the question is going to be whether the meta has evolved so far ahead of him that he won't be as effective as he was, or will this put him back into viability? Because his bullets aren't the only thing receiving a buff. His sprint ability has as well. The delay before you can fire the weapon after using sprint has been reduced from 0.5 to 0.3 seconds. That's an insanely great buff, especially when you're being chased by enemies and want to turn around and fight. Having to wait half a second before you can even begin firing was a pretty huge punishment. So these changes are honestly such great buffs to smoothen out Soldier's gameplay. I'm of the opinion that ideally, Soldier 76 should be able to function as a relatively safe pick on ladder that players can possibly rely on slotting into different compositions. Because prior to this, he was pretty underwhelming a pick, especially when you consider how strong he used to be. So I totally welcome this buff and I can't wait to see how he turns out. Additionally, Tactical Visor also targets Riptire now, just like in the Junkenstein's Revenge Halloween game mode, because why not, right? It's pretty neat. Speaking of nice things, ORISA's movement speed penalty while firing has been reduced from 50% to 30%. So this is just a great change, right? I totally love it. Because when playing as ORISA, you really want to be able to do as many things as you can at once. You want to be shooting, moving, pulling, and repositioning your shield, especially when you're shield bouncing and shooting at an enemy. So not being as sluggishly slow anymore while shooting is really good for repositioning as well as chasing down kills. Moving on, Hanzo's sonic arrow detection radius has been increased from 7 to 9 meters. Now, I don't really know why Hanzo received or even needed a buff, because I think once the GOAT's heavy meta subsides and we go back to something like basic 222, he will still be quite a good pick. He was pretty good during the brief double sniper meta, but of course now we have heroes like Ashe, so who knows. I guess since it isn't a buff to his damage, it's kind of fine, but I do think they could have just instead buffed it by 1 meter instead of 2, but that's just my opinion. I'm glad they're willing to look at heroes that people might not have thought of, so that's cool. Hammond aka Wrecking Ball's buff comes in the form of his adaptive shields no longer cancelling his roll mode once activated. Okay, straight up, I love Hammond. When played well, he's a great hero to watch and of course use. Adaptive shields cancelling roll mode and forcing you out of a possible grapple position always felt super clunky. But I viewed it as a kind of necessary trade-off, right? Like you sacrifice positioning and mobility for more sustain. This totally gets rid of the clunkiness of playing Hammond effectively. To be honest, I'm actually a bit afraid of how oppressive this might end up being, but I honestly don't know what to expect of the upcoming meta at the moment, so we'll have to see. And the last hero to receive just a flat out buff this patch is Pharah. The minimum explosion damage of her rockets has been increased from 16.25 to 20 damage. So her maximum damage per rocket has not been increased, just the minimum. Right, so 3.75 extra damage doesn't really seem like much, right? But think of this change as something that's meant to dismantle tankier deathball compositions, also known as GOATs obviously. Even if you're just doing splash damage, as long as it's hitting a grouped up team, that's easily an extra bit of ultimate charge gained in the long run. And though her barrage can be quite difficult to get value out of, it is still a pretty deadly ultimate. A buff to the Rocket Queen is something that I will always welcome due to her being my first ever main when I started playing Overwatch. I just love her a lot, you know? Anyway, let's move on to some adjustments made this patch. Zarya's alternate fire radius of her grenades has been changed to 2 meters regardless of energy level. So previously, the radius varied from 1 to 2 meters at low energy and 2 to 3 meters at high energy. This is an interesting change in that it lowers both the skill ceiling and skill floor of Zarya, assuming I'm using those two terms right. The change seriously sucks for good Zarya players who can consistently maintain good energy levels as well as those good at targeting their grenades. And obviously, this is great for Zarya players who aren't that great at either. At its core, this change is an attempt to kind of slow down how fast Zarya players can generate ultimate charge through grenade spam. Because previously, a high energy charged grenade with 3 meter explosion radius could honestly net you a ton of ultimate charge. And while this change does let you get more use out of low energy grenades, the damage obviously won't be as high. Personally, I kind of view this as a nerf that isn't really needed because while Zarya is super devastating in the GOATS meta, if we ever shift away from tank heavy compositions, she's going to really want that extra 1 meter back. Anyway, some adjustments have happened to McCree this patch as well, with the first one being that his fan to hammer damage being nerfed from 55 damage down to 50 damage a bullet. And you know what? I'll say it, good. All jokes aside, the buff that initially raised the damage up to 55 was a much needed buff to everyone's favorite cowboy, but it had situations where it could get very, very oppressive really fast. His fan to hammer is still going to be a pretty decent semi-burst damage ability, but it's not all that bad because his Deadeye has received a very, very big buff. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, how Deadeye used to work is that once you hit the button, that is your Q or whatever it is on console, you start slowly locking onto enemies in your line of sight and accumulating up to 80 damage. And 1 second after activation, the damage you accumulate rises up to 275 damage a second. Even after you see a red skull on a target, this accumulation still goes on, so you can do excessive damage. So, new Deadeye doubles the damage accumulation at 550 damage a second after 1.5 seconds. So this might sound kinda scary, but there's a good reason for that. It kinda is. If you're playing a squishy hero with 250 health or less, you don't have to worry too much because nothing changes for you. But if you're a tank or hiding behind a shield, you really should start moving around a corner behind a wall. With the new Deadeye, McCree can channel 2 to 3,000 damage a bullet, which can potentially bust through any shield in a game, particularly shields with more than one target behind them. It's kind of funny because Deadeye used to be like this kind of ultimate that players could easily forget about and not preemptively play around of due to the window of time to get to cover. But now if you suspect the enemy McCree has one at the ready, you might want to play more carefully around it. Moving on, Widowmaker's Infrasight now reveals enemy health bars to the team, but also deactivates upon Widowmaker's death. Now, the health bar effect is rather cool in my opinion. It's not something I ever thought was needed, but now that it's here, it kind of makes sense in that it gives your team additional information about the enemies. With the trade-off obviously being that there is now counterplay to the ability in the form of killing the Widowmaker that activated it, which is a pretty neat change in my opinion. Okay, Mei's primary fire, which is her blaster spray, has been buffed, upping its damage from 2.25 to 2.75 a hit, which is effectively translated to 55 damage per second, up from 45. Note that doing more damage doesn't mean you freeze enemies faster, but in the event that they do get frozen, they will be slightly weaker than before. But the increase in damage can help in targeting enemies that are being slowly trickle healed by sources such as the payload. Anyway, an interesting change to Mei as well is the nerf to her Ice Wall's health. So if I'm not mistaken, Ice Wall raises 5 pillars of joined ice with 500 health each. This change knocks down the health of the pillars to 400 health each. 100 health being taken away from each segment might not seem like much, but if you consider the situations where a wall might be used, it actually is. Such as a team being split into two and having to break down the wall as fast as possible. Taking away some usefulness from her utility and putting it into her raw damage is a pretty nice change to Mei. Torbjorn's Overload has been nerfed, reducing the temporary armor gain from 150 down to 100 armor. However, that 50 missing armor has been added to his permanent health pool. I actually think this is a buff, though I have seen some people think otherwise, which is why I decided to leave it as an adjustment. Okay, so more than anything, playing a 200 HP Torbjorn with no armor felt really weird. It was like you're naked or something. So having more recoverable health, especially recoverable armor, is just plain great in my opinion. The situations where you'd be worse off than before are where you find yourself low on health to start with and having to pop Overload to survive. Then you would probably want that extra 50 armor back. Otherwise, I think this is a good redistribution of his sustainability. This next change is one that I'm honestly not surprised by at all. Zenyatta's Discord Orb damage amplification has been reduced from 30% down to 25%. Now, Zenyatta is my main go-to support in rank, so I'm not biased when I say this nerf has been a long time coming. This card is such a devastatingly powerful ability, so it's really nice to see Blizzard willing to make some changes to it. And to compensate him personally, the damage of his orbs has been buffed up from 46 to 48 damage. This is to match the previous effect of fighting an opposing hero while they are discorded. So while this is a big nerf to overall team utility, take some solace in the fact that your orbs are doing a little bit more damage than before. Moving on, Junkrat's Frag Grenade Launcher has been buffed, upping the impact damage of each shot from 40 to 50 damage. And yes, this is an overall damage buff, with direct grenade hits now doing 130 damage instead of 120. This is a really great buff to skilled Junkrat players that can purposely go for those direct hits as opposed to blind and lucky spam. However, spam is the name of the game with Junkrat, especially when trying to break down shields. And unlike moving heroes, shields are very difficult to miss, so this buff will help greatly in that aspect. The flip side is that the ultimate cost of his Riptire has been increased by 10% in order to balance out his increased damage. And once again, we have a change to how armor functions. I can't stress enough how happy I am that Blizzard are willing to take a look at core game mechanics and adjust them as needed. So, the first change to armor is that beam type damage is now reduced by 20% when hitting armor. Let's be clear, this is not an additional 20% reduction on top of the old armor mechanic. This is a new mechanic in place of how the armor used to handle beam type damage. For those who might not know what beam type damage is, it's damage that is dealt continuously over a period of time. Some clear examples would be Winston's Tesla Cannon, Zarya's Particle Cannon Laser, SYMMETRA's Photon Projector Beam, as well as MOIRA's Biotic Grasp. Previously, armor was really strong against lower damage beam weapons, being able to pretty much cut incoming damage in half. So this change heavily benefits heroes like Winston, Mei, and MOIRA, who now do much better damage against armor. However, heroes with high damage beam weapons actually do about the same or even slightly less damage against armor than before. These are heroes like Zarya or SYMMETRA at their highest damage capacity. And the second change to armor is that damage over time effects are now no longer mitigated by armor at all. Abilities that do damage over time are like Ashe's Dynamite, Widowmaker's Venomine, and even Zarya's Graviton Surge. This is actually quite a huge buff for Ashe because in tank-heavy metas, it was pretty easy for her to farm ultimate charge by just repeatedly showering clumped up heroes with the burn from her Dynamite. Now this will be even more effective than ever before without armor heavily reducing its damage. These two changes bring about a little bit more consistency to how armor interacts with external damage. And speaking of external damage, there's been a swap in how damage boosting abilities such such as Nano Boost or Mercy's Boost interacts with other heroes' projectiles. The boost is now applied when a projectile is fired rather than when it hits a target. I know in terms of practicality it makes sense that the order would be that way, however I do feel like this kind of takes away a bit of the skill involved in damage boosting an ally's projectiles as Mercy. For example, if you're part of a pharmacy combo, you'd have to vigilantly alternate towards damage from healing as soon as a projectile is going to land in order for the damage boost to occur. So there was a little bit of skill involved in that, but now you can just boost the damage of the projectile right off the bat and forget about it. Like I said, it makes sense and I'm sure it feels less clunky, but I'm just so used to the old way it functioned. Okay, another pretty big change this patch are some tweaks to how knockback functions. Basically, knockback distance is now going to be more consistent across the board. This can be easily demonstrated by Lucio using his boop on a number of heroes using their movement abilities. It used to be there was quite a huge variance in knockback depending on how the target was moving. If they were moving against the knockback, they move less, and if they were moving with it, they get moved even more. In a way, this is a pretty big buff to Lucio as you're going to consistently get more value out of your boops, whether it's to knock an enemy off the map or mess up an engagement. Additionally, flying heroes such as D.Va and Mercy can now be properly knocked back while they are mid-flight as well. Flying used to be a mechanic that pretty strongly resisted knockback, so being able to influence their mid-air mobility now is pretty neat and does affect D.Va quite a bit. And speaking of D.Va, her and ORISA can now be more easily knocked back while they are firing their weapons. Both of them are slowed down while firing their weapons, and this effect kind of created like an anchor that strongly kept them in place against external knockback. So now this anchor is less effective and players will find that they are no longer as immovable as they once were. Okay, we're almost done with this patch, just some nerfs to go over. Anna's Nano Boost burst heal has been reduced from 300 to 250 health. I really liked when this aspect of her boost was introduced because it was a pretty nice buff that did end up having its uses. When paired with a Biotic Grenade, the heal could totally swing the balance of a fight by bringing a tank back from the verge of death. However, I think Blizzard seemed to want to crack down on super strong burst healing, which is why they decided to remove 50 HP from the burst. I expect to see a bit more Anna being played in the upcoming meta, so I reckon a small anticipatory nerf seems alright. Speaking of healing, Reaper's Reaping passive has been reduced from 50% to 40%. Now, I'm of the opinion that Reaper was not really that great of a hero, and buffing his lifesteal was merely an attempt at a band-aid fix to help him out. I'd really rather see changes to his Shadow Step than a constant flip-flopping of how much he can lifesteal. That being said, 50% lifesteal was kind of obnoxious in some situations, particularly in the chaos of the solo queue ladder. The small dial back to 40% seems totally fine. It's not really going to change how good or how bad he is overall. And finally, the last change this patch is to Lucio, and boy did they do my boy dirty. Well, not really. Anyone who plays a ton of Lucio would have totally seen this coming. I mean, a near 100% pick rate in professional play is pretty telling, isn't it? This nerf tones down his Speed Aura's utility for his team as a whole. His Speed Aura's effect has been lowered from 30% to 20%, and the amped up effect lowered from 70% to 50%. This as a whole makes Lucio slower as well when walking regularly, but if you're playing Lucio and not wall riding whenever it's appropriate, you're not really maximizing his potential anyway. So to compensate for him being slowed down, his wall ride passive movement speed bonus has been increased from 20% to 40%, which feels pretty nice. Being the only hero in the game that can influence team speed is what makes him such a valuable part of any composition. That plus a very decent defensive ultimate is the reason why he sees an almost universal pick rate in the professional scene. Cutting down the extra speed he provides is definitely the way to go when trying to balance his usefulness of being a must pick. But remember, his boop is now much better than before due to the momentum changes, so it's not all that bad. That's it for all the changes, but we also have something new this patch in the form of Baptiste. Now, I'm not going to go over his entire kit in this video because it's, let's be honest, it's long enough, but as it is, I think he's strong enough to find himself a fit into a few compositions. His immortality feel is definitely one to watch out for, especially when used in conjunction with bunker comps with ORISA, Bastion, and Junkrat. And his amplification matrix ultimate definitely introduces a whole new set of math equations in terms of damage breakpoints. Plus, you get like space boots, you know? That's pretty cool. That's it for this patch, and boy, that was a lot to cover. As I've mentioned already, this patch is a really strong attempt at dismantling the tank heavy goats meta, and I sincerely hope it does, as it's been quite stale to spectate and play. So it's going to be super interesting to see how a new meta develops over the next few weeks or even months. So thanks everyone for watching. If I missed any changes in this video, I am so sorry because there are so many. I'm pretty sure I got all of them that are important anyway. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed the video and leave a like. You can also support me on Patreon or leave me a tip on PayPal. I really appreciate it. It keeps the lights on. Not really, but yeah, it's nice. Otherwise, take care, have fun, and thank you again for watching.